There's a very specific category of moment that produces genuine shock in a narcissist. Not irritation, not the familiar frustration of someone not giving him what he wants, but real disorienting shock, the kind that catches his entire psychological system off guard because it violates something he assumed was permanently, reliably true. Most things don't actually shock a narcissist. He's built an entire life around anticipating and managing predictable human reactions: anger, tears, pleading, forgiveness, the whole familiar cycle he's learned to navigate with practiced ease. What genuinely shocks him is rare precisely because it requires something outside this familiar cycle entirely, something his extensive experience with people simply hasn't prepared him to expect or successfully manage. Today, we're walking through 7 of these moments, genuine shock points, not ordinary frustration, and understanding exactly why each one lands so much harder than anything resembling a normal confrontation ever could. 1. Discovering you documented everything. Most people, even those who eventually leave narcissistic relationships, carry their experience primarily as memory, fragmented, sometimes doubted, vulnerable to his confident insistence that events unfolded differently than they remember. A narcissist counts on this vulnerability. His entire narrative control strategy depends on your memory being the only record available, something he can reliably outargue, reframe, or simply insist is mistaken. When he discovers, whether through a conversation, a legal proceeding, or simply an offhand comment, that you kept records, dates, screenshots, a written account maintained in real time rather than reconstructed after the fact, something genuinely destabilizes. This isn't simply inconvenient for him. It reveals that you were never as disoriented, as easily managed, or as reliant on his version of events as he assumed. It suggests a version of you operating with more clarity and more foresight than his mental model ever accounted for, which forces an uncomfortable recalibration of exactly how much control he actually had throughout the relationship. 2. You're calm during what should have been his most effective attack. Every narcissist has a signature move, the specific tactic that's worked most reliably throughout his life to produce exactly the emotional collapse or capitulation he's seeking. When he deploys this tactic, expecting the same result it's always produced before, and instead receives nothing, no visible distress, no scrambling defense, simply calm, level acknowledgement. The shock isn't about losing the argument. It's about discovering that his most reliable tool has, without warning, stopped functioning entirely. This specific shock tends to linger considerably longer than ordinary disappointment, precisely because it forces him to question something he's never previously had reason to question, whether this specific tactic still works on anyone, or whether it only ever worked because you, specifically, allowed it to. 3. Learning that people believed you without needing convincing. A narcissist typically assumes, based on considerable prior experience, that his narrative will win by default, that his charm, his confidence, his practiced performance of reasonableness will naturally outcompete your account, especially with people who know him socially or professionally. When he discovers that people believed you immediately, without requiring extensive persuasion, without needing him to even present his counter-narrative before already recognizing the pattern he was hoping to obscure, this produces genuine shock because it reveals his social capital was never actually as unshakable as he'd assumed. 4. Watching you build something impressive that has nothing to do with him. This shock operates differently from the others because it doesn't involve direct confrontation at all. It simply involves witnessing, often from a distance, genuine evidence that your life has continued flourishing in ways entirely disconnected from his influence, his validation, or his continued relevance. For someone whose entire sense of significance depends on believing he leaves a permanent mark on everyone who encounters him, this quiet, undramatic evidence of your independent thriving often lands harder than any direct confrontation ever could. Together, these first 4 shock points reveal something crucial about what actually destabilizes a narcissist most profoundly. Not anger, not accusation, but evidence that fundamentally contradicts his working model of who you are and how much control he actually had. 5. Discovering that his charm simply doesn't register with you anymore. This shock is distinct from the calm during attack shock we discussed earlier, because it operates on a different timeline and a different mechanism entirely. Watching his charm fail during a single confrontation is one thing. Discovering, gradually, over repeated attempts, that his charm has stopped registering with you at all, not just in moments of conflict, but during his best material, his most practiced warmth, the specific behaviors that have reliably disarmed almost everyone else in his life, represent something considerably more destabilizing. Remember what we've discussed extensively throughout previous conversations about how central charm is to a narcissist's entire operational strategy. It's not simply a pleasant social skill layered on top of his personality. It's often the primary mechanism through which he secures nearly everything he needs: admiration, compliance, forgiveness, continued access. When this specific tool, tested and refined across years of successful deployment, produces nothing from you, no warming, no softening, no visible response at all, just the same neutral, unmoved attention he'd offer a stranger, he encounters something genuinely rare in his experience. Proof that his most fundamental skill has an actual limit, one he never previously believed existed. This shock often produces a specific, telling behavior worth understanding. Repeated, increasingly elaborate attempts to test whether this failure was simply a fluke, whether trying harder, being more charming, more attentive, more impressive might eventually break through this unexpected resistance. Watching these escalating attempts consistently fail tends to compound the original shock considerably, because each failed attempt provides additional confirmation of something his psychology genuinely struggles to accept. 6. Realizing you've stopped needing him to apologize. Most people who've been genuinely wronged carry, at least for a while, a visible hope for acknowledgement, some sign, however small, that the person who hurt them recognizes what happened. Narcissists, whether consciously or not, often rely on this hope as a form of ongoing leverage, understanding that as long as you're still waiting for an apology that validates your experience, some thread of continued engagement remains available to him. When he discovers, often through your own calm indication or simply through your behavior over time, that you've genuinely released this need, that your peace no longer requires his acknowledgement, his accountability, or his understanding in order to feel complete, this produces a specific disorienting shock. It reveals that whatever leverage he assumed this unmet need still provided has quietly, completely dissolved without his ever being consulted or informed. He's lost access to a form of control he didn't even realize he was still relying on until its absence became undeniable. 7. Discovering that your description of him, when it finally reaches him secondhand, is completely, devastatingly accurate. This final shock is often the most significant of all 7, precisely because it strikes directly at the narrative control mechanism we've discussed throughout many previous conversations. A narcissist typically assumes, based on considerable experience, that any account you give of the relationship will eventually be dismissed as exaggeration, as bitterness, as one-sided emotional reaction rather than accurate observation. When he eventually hears, through mutual connections or simply through reputation, that your account of who he actually is has been consistently validated by others, described with a precision and consistency that leaves no obvious room for the kind of dismissal he's always relied on, something genuinely, permanently shifts. This isn't simply embarrassing for him. It confirms something his psychological architecture has spent an entire lifetime avoiding, that his careful, curated self-presentation has a genuine crack in it, one specific person managed to see through completely and articulate accurately enough that others recognize the truth in it without requiring extensive convincing. This particular shock tends to be the one that lingers longest, precisely because it can't be easily dismissed, argued against, or successfully reframe the way so many of his previous conflicts eventually were. Together, these 7 moments reveal something important about what genuinely shocks a narcissist, distinct from what merely frustrates or angers him. Each one involves the same underlying mechanism, evidence that fundamentally contradicts his working assumptions about how much control, how much influence, how much lasting significance he actually holds in your life and in the perception of people around him. None of these moments require dramatic confrontation to produce their effect. Several of them require the opposite: calm, quiet, undramatic evidence that simply, definitively contradicts what he's always assumed to be true. Understanding why these 7 moments produce such genuine, lasting shock reveals something worth examining directly, because it explains a pattern you may have already noticed if you've experienced any of these moments yourself. The shock, however real and however visible in the moment, rarely translates into anything resembling lasting change on his part. And understanding exactly why this is true, rather than simply accepting it as a disappointing footnote, matters enormously for how you carry this entire conversation forward. This is worth stating clearly, because it's tempting, once you understand how genuinely destabilizing these moments can be, to hope they might eventually produce the accountability or reflection you spent years wishing for during the relationship itself. Remember what we've traced across many previous conversations about narcissistic psychology and its structural incapacity for sustained self-reflection. Shock, even genuine, profound shock, typically gets absorbed through the same defensive architecture we've discussed extensively: narrative reconstruction, minimization, redirection of blame. Whatever combination of strategies allows him to eventually process the disruption without ever fully integrating what it actually revealed about himself. Here's what that absorption process typically looks like in practice, because seeing it laid out concretely helps dismantle any lingering hope that shock alone might function as a turning point. When he encounters your documentation, his first instinct isn't genuine reckoning with what it reveals about his own behavior. It's usually an urgent search for whatever framing might minimize its significance, dismissing it as obsessive, as evidence of your own instability rather than his conduct, as something taken out of context that doesn't reflect the full picture. When your calm during his best attack fails to produce the reaction he expected, he doesn't typically conclude that his tactics were flawed. He more often concludes that you've become cold, that something has changed in you that requires explaining away rather than something in his own approach that deserves examination. This pattern repeats across all 7 shock points, and recognizing it protects you from a specific kind of disappointment that otherwise tends to follow these moments. You might find yourself, in the aftermath of witnessing one of these genuine shocks, quietly hoping this particular instance will be different, that this time the disruption is significant enough to finally break through. Understanding the defensive architecture in advance prevents this hope from taking root in the first place, because you already know the shock, however real, will most likely be absorbed and reframed rather than genuinely metabolized into lasting change. Here's what actually matters about understanding these 7 moments, beyond simply cataloging what shocks a narcissist for its own sake. Each one represents something you built, deliberately or through the natural progression of genuine healing, entirely independent of any strategy specifically designed to shock or destabilize him. The documentation wasn't created to eventually surprise him. It was created to protect your own clarity and your own case, if one ever became necessary. The calm during his most practiced attack wasn't performed to disorient him. It emerged from genuine internal work that happened to produce this effect as an incidental consequence, not as its primary goal. This distinction matters enormously for how you should actually relate to this entire list, because approaching any of these 7 behaviors as a strategy specifically designed to shock him represents exactly the kind of continued orientation around his reaction that we've cautioned against throughout many previous conversations. The moment you start calibrating your own healing according to whether it successfully destabilizes him, you've handed back exactly the kind of ongoing relevance and attention his psychology depends on, even while believing you're doing the opposite. There's a specific trap worth naming directly here, because it's easy to fall into without recognizing it's happening. Once you understand how effectively these 7 behaviors genuinely disrupt narcissistic psychology, there's a real temptation to start performing them deliberately, watching for his reaction, measuring your own progress by how visibly shaken he appears to be. This transforms something that was genuinely, authentically yours. Your documentation, your calm, your independence, your accurate perception, into a performance calibrated for an audience of one. And performance, even performance of genuine qualities, carries a fundamentally different psychological function than authentic expression does. It keeps you oriented toward him, watching, waiting, measuring, exactly the ongoing engagement his psychology actually requires in order to remain relevant in your life at all. Real power here doesn't come from successfully shocking a narcissist, satisfying as that might occasionally feel in an isolated moment. It comes from building a life so genuinely, completely your own, that his shock becomes simply an incidental byproduct of your own authentic growth, rather than something you're actively working to produce. The documentation matters because it served your own protection and clarity. The calm matters because it reflects your own genuine internal peace. The independence of your flourishing life matters because it represents your own authentic path forward, not because it happens to leave him disoriented when he eventually encounters evidence of it. This is ultimately the most important thing to understand about everything we've discussed today. These 7 moments genuinely do shock a narcissist to his core, and there's a real human satisfaction in recognizing that your own healing has produced consequences he never anticipated and can't successfully manage. But this satisfaction should exist alongside your own continued growth, not as its primary purpose. The goal was never to shock him. The goal was always to become someone genuinely whole, genuinely at peace, genuinely secure in her own perception and her own worth. Someone whose life, built entirely on these authentic foundations, simply happens to be unshockable to encounter for someone whose entire strategy depended on you remaining exactly as manageable, as uncertain, and as reliant on his validation as you once were. If you recognize yourself in any of these 7 moments, if you've documented what happened, if you've discovered your own calm during his best attempts to destabilize you, if you've released the need for his apology, if you've built something genuinely yours that has nothing to do with him at all, understand what this actually represents. Not a strategy that successfully worked against him, though it may have. Evidence, undeniable and permanently yours, of exactly how far your own healing has actually traveled. He may never fully process what any of these moments actually revealed about his own limitations. He may spend the rest of his life managing the discomfort they produced through exactly the same defensive strategies that have protected him from genuine self-reflection throughout everything we've discussed across these many conversations. He may tell a version of your story to the next person, and the person after that, one where your documentation becomes evidence of your instability, where your calm becomes evidence of your coldness, where your independence becomes evidence that you never really cared in the first place. This retelling is likely, and it belongs entirely to him, a permanent feature of his own psychological architecture that exists completely independent of what actually happened between you. But that processing, or the permanent absence of it, was never actually the point. The point was always you, becoming someone he could no longer predict, control, or successfully manage. Not because you were trying to shock him, but because you were finally, completely becoming exactly who you were always meant to be, entirely on your own terms, regardless of whether he ever fully understood what he was witnessing when he encountered the person you'd become. Whatever shock these moments produced in him was simply the sound of a system encountering something it was never built to withstand. You didn't build that system's downfall. You simply finally stopped being part of what held it up. Thanks for watching.